Many years ago, I used to work at a day camp with young kids, and part of my duties included entertaining them, and part of that was singing with them. So the kids used to love singing the song that doesn't end. And as I was putting together the lectures for this chapter, that song came to mind. Now, I don't have a great voice, but this is how I felt as I was putting these lectures together, and you might feel this way having to listen to them. This is the chapter that never ends. Yes, it goes on and on, my friend. Some people started studying and learning lots and lots, and their courses will be easier because of all their work. So hang in there. This is the last lecture for this chapter, and if you understand how all the tissues work and all of their components, I promise, when you get to your future chapters, your work will be that much easier because you'll have a firm foundation on which to build your future knowledge. So let's get to the last tissues for the human body. So your objectives for this video are to explain the functions and characteristics of nervous, muscle, mesenchyme, and membranes. In the lab, you should be able to identify each tissue type that we're going to talk about in this video if you happen to see it on an image or on a slide. Let's start with muscle tissue. We're going to study muscle tissue in a bit more detail in Chapter 9, so for now, it's just enough to have kind of a general idea of the different tissues and their structures. All of your muscle tissues are specialized for contraction. They turn the chemical energy of ATP into the mechanical energy of movement, and this serves a lot of different functions in the human body. For example, muscle contractions are moving my mouth and my tongue so that I can form the words and communicate with you vocally. But if you were looking at me using a webcam, you would see that my face is very animated, and I'm also conveying emotion and expression with my eyes and my eyebrows, my mouth, whether it's smiling or not. We basically use our muscles for that. Our muscles are involved in our hearing. The smallest muscle in the body is actually attached to one of the bones in your ear, and it helps to move the bone back and forth to adjust your inner ear to the sounds that you're hearing. Your muscles they contract to help push blood through your body. They also contract to help push food through your digestive system and out of your body. So all of that is possible because these tissues are designed for contraction, and they're all using ATP in order to drive that contraction. And again, we'll look at that in more detail in Chapter 9. The main component of muscle tissue is the muscle cell. It's also sometimes called a muscle fiber or a myocyte. And these cells have a few different unique characteristics, but the one that I really want you to remember right now is that they're excitable. So that means that they're able to carry electrical impulses across their surface, and they contract in response to that. So they are excitable. There's only two types of cell in the body that's excitable in this way. One are the neurons, which are part of your nervous system, and then you've got the muscle cells. There are three types of muscle tissue. The one that's most common is the skeletal muscle, and this is the type of muscle that's attached to the bones of your skeleton, where its contraction produces body movement. So for example, if you hold your hand in front of your face, although you're not doing it with your other hand, if your brain tells you to move your forefinger on that hand and you move it, you should know that there are skeletal muscles that are contracting in a coordinated manner to cause that movement. So these muscles pull on the bones to move parts of the body. If we look at these muscles under the microscope, we'll see that they're striped. So if you have a good monitor, and you look in this area of the image on the left side of your screen, or you look here, you can see that there's a striped pattern running through the muscle cells. This is called striation. And there's only two types of muscle that are striated. One is the skeletal muscle and the other is cardiac, which we'll look at in a few minutes. Your skeletal muscle is under voluntary or conscious control. What this basically means is that you consciously, using your brain, decide to move those muscles. Now, you don't tell each individual muscle to move consciously. Consciously, you just say, I want to move my finger, or I need to grab that cup of water. And your brain works out and coordinates the electrical impulses that cause the right muscle cells to contract at the right time so that you can move your hands and your arm to reach out and grab that cup of water or that bottle of water. Does that make sense? I hope it does. The point is, you think somewhere in your brain about the movement that you want to create. You don't think about it on the very detailed level as to what cells and what muscles have to be contracted, but that contraction starts with a conscious thought. The cells in your muscle are very long. They basically go the length of the muscle. They are cylindrical, like you see here. And they are also multinucleate. So these muscle cells actually develop from individual embryonic cells that fuse together at some point during your development. And the nuclei from those embryonic cells come along when the fusion happens. And so we wind up with cells that have more than one nucleus. That's what multinucleate means. The second type of muscle is called smooth muscle. So smooth muscle is not striated. So this is a picture of it here on the left. You can see there are no obvious stripes. This tissue is also involuntary. So what that means is that it's still controlled. The contraction of these muscles are still controlled by your nervous system, but you don't actually think about contracting them. For example, when you eat a hamburger, you don't think, I need to push that through my intestines. I need to contract those intestinal muscles, contract, 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 in order to get that food through your intestines, right? It just kind of happens automatically. That's what we mean by involuntary. Smooth muscle is found in the walls of nearly every hollow organ in the body. It's found in your blood vessels, where it helps the blood vessels to have a smaller diameter or a larger one. It's in your eyes, controlling how much light comes into your eye and hits your retina. It also controls the position of your lens in your eye so you can focus on things that are close or far away. There's smooth muscle in your skin. Every time you get goosebumps, that's a response to smooth muscle pulling on your hair follicles and making your hair stand up. It's also in the ducts of certain glands, and it helps those glands to secrete. Your smooth muscle is characterized by flattened cells, so they look kind of like squamous cells, but they're not squamous cells. And each cell will have a centrally located ovoid nucleus, like this one. So each nucleus looks a bit like an oval. Okay. Most cells are actually joined to the plasma membrane of an adjacent cell by gap junctions. Remember, gap junctions are formed by proteins that essentially make a tunnel between adjacent cells so that they can share cytoplasm. So that happens in these cells. Generally, the cells that are in smooth muscle are spindle-shaped. So that means that they're going to have very narrow ends and a wide belly in the middle. Let me see if I can grab my pen and draw one for you up here. We'll see if this works. But, oops. Basically, you have a wide middle and then very thin ends. That's what a spindle looks like. Okay. So these are spindle-shaped cells. This is cardiac muscle. Cardiac muscle is the third type of muscle. It's composed of cardiac muscle cells, and since the muscle name has cardiac in it, where do you think we're going to find this? Right, in the heart. So these cells are striated like the skeletal muscle cells. If you look really closely over here, you can see some horizontal stripes. Remember, horizontal means left to right. So horizontal stripes going up and down on this slide. These cells are branched and they're uninucleate, meaning they have one nucleus. So each of these little purple ovals that you see here, these are nuclei for these cells. And if you look really closely, you might actually be able to see where the cells branch. Cardiac muscle is involuntary, just like the smooth muscle. So again, remember, it's not like you're sitting at your desk thinking, pump, 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 each time you want your heart to contract and push blood through your blood vessels, right? It kind of happens without you consciously thinking about it. That's what we mean by involuntary. Okay. So, one last thing that I need to tell you is that muscle tissue has a unique characteristic. These little dark purple lines here, these are called intercalated discs. Okay, hopefully you can see those as a dark line separating individual cardiac muscle cells. Those tend to be present when two cells kind of fuse together or they come together. And this is a unique characteristic that we see for cardiac muscle. So if you happen to have this on a lab practical and you're not sure what tissue you're looking at, see if there are stripes and see if you see those intercalated discs. Those would let you know that you're looking at cardiac. This is nervous tissue. It makes up the majority of your brain and your spinal cord. You also find nervous tissue in your nerves. There are two main types of cells in nervous tissue. You have neurons. Those are the big purple star-shaped cells that you see, like these. And then you have what are called neuroglia cells. And the neuroglia cells, you can't really discern in this image, but you can see their nuclei. They are the dark, tiny pinpoint dots that you see. Each one of those belongs to some sort of neuroglia cell. So the neurons are mainly responsible for transmitting electrical signals throughout the body. Neuroglia cells support the neurons in their function. Neurons, before I move on, are kind of like your muscle cells in that they're excitable. They respond to chemical stimuli and generate electrical impulses that result in different functions that happen in the body. These cells reproduce while you're in your mother's womb, but shortly before birth, they stop reproducing. This is why when someone has a brain injury or they have a spinal cord injury, it's very difficult to repair that, and they may suffer permanent effects because of it. This tissue looks similar to the last one, right? But this isn't nervous tissue. This is actually mesenchyme. Mesenchyme is an embryonic tissue. It's comprised of loose cells that are embedded in a mesh of proteins and fluid. This loose fluid nature of mesenchyme allows its cells to migrate and play a crucial role in the origin and development of body structures during the embryonic and fetal stages of life. Embryonic tissue is derived from mesoderm. So if you're familiar with embryos, they have three basic layers: the endoderm, the mesoderm, and the ectoderm. The mesoderm is the one that's right in the middle. And this tissue consists of undifferentiated connective tissue. So undifferentiated basically means that this is connective tissue, but it hasn't decided what it's going to be. These cells will rely on chemical signals in the tissue to actually change to become some sort of connective tissue that we would recognize. So mesenchyme eventually gives rise to tissues like bone or cartilage. It also gives rise to tissues that are related to the lymphatic system and the circulatory system. You'll know mesoderm when you see it because the cells look kind of star-like. At least they do to me. Okay, so you'll have this kind of star-like cell, and it's in a reticulofiber background. So you can kind of see the fibers back here where they support the cells and help form this tissue. Okay, so reticular fibrils and star-shaped cells. Membranes are thin sheets of one or more tissues that line a body surface or a body cavity. Most consist of a superficial epithelial layer resting on a connective tissue layer, and sometimes there's smooth muscle just under the connective tissue layer. Membranes have a lot of functions. They help hold your body organs in place. They form barriers, dividing the body up into compartments. They also play a role in immunity, and they secrete substances. So I'm going to give you 4 examples of membranes, and hopefully you'll see each of these functions as I go through these membranes. Membranes can be divided into 2 groups. You have the true membranes, which consist of a layer of epithelial tissue resting on top of a layer of connective tissue. And then you have the membrane-like structures. So these are going to be structures that perform the same functions as true membranes, but they may have a different structure. They're not going to simply be the epithelial layer and connective tissue layer. So your true membranes are going to be totally enclosed within the body. They do not open to the outside. And there are 2 types that you need to know for this class: your serous membranes, or serosei, and the synovial membranes. Serous membranes, or serosei, are single-layer membranes that line the thoracic and abdominal cavities, in particular, but they can be located in other places in the body as well. These membranes consist of a single layer of epithelial tissue, like you see here, that sits atop a single layer of loose connective tissue. That's the part in pink here. The membrane folds on itself, making 2 layers, and the 2 layers are separated by a thin film or a thin layer of liquid called serous fluid, which is denoted in the blue here. The serous fluid is secreted by the epithelial tissue. Now, the layers of these tissues have different names. The outer layer that faces the body wall and other organs is called the parietal layer. The parietal layer. So you can see parietal written right here. The inner layer of the membrane that covers the organs of your body is called the visceral layer. So this is visceral right here, the visceral layer. Now in this diagram that you see here, the serous membrane is called the pericardium. So that's why you have the parietal pericardium and the visceral pericardium. But if we were in another part of the body, like around the lungs, it would be called the pleurae. So you'd have the visceral layer of the pleura and the parietal layer of the pleura. So just be aware of that. So the parietal layer lines the body cavities and the body walls and other organs, but the visceral layer covers the organs. And I tend to remember that because the viscera are the organs, so the visceral layer covers the organs. Now, the serous fluid that separates the layers of the membrane make the membranes extremely slippery, so that when organs move in their cavities or when they rub against each other, they're protected from mechanical damage and friction. So if you think about the heart, for example, each time it beats, it undergoes a rather significant movement, and it moves within the pericardial space. It would become severely damaged if every time the heart contracted, it rubbed up against the lungs. The lungs would be damaged and the heart. So it's good that both are surrounded by these serous membranes, which again are protective. So they protect against mechanical damage, that's rubbing damage, and friction. The peritoneum, which surrounds the intestines, the pericardial sac, which surrounds the heart, and the pleurae, which surround the lungs, are examples of serous membranes. Now, I know we've been on quarantine due to COVID, and life has been different, but if you watch daytime network television, you may have seen commercials from different law offices talking about mesothelioma. Mesothelioma is a condition in which a malignant tumor forms in the serous membranes that line the lungs, the heart, or the abdomen. The tumor is caused by exposure to asbestos, a fire retardant that was very popular in around the 1950s. Synovial membranes line cavities that surround your freely movable joints like the knee or the shoulder. These membranes are made up of two layers of connective tissue without a layer of epithelial cells. The outer layer of the membrane is composed of dense irregular connective tissue, and next to that you have a layer of loose connective tissue. So together, these two are the outer layer of the synovial membrane. Interior to that, you have a layer of specialized fibroblasts called synoviocytes. Synoviocytes secrete synovial fluid, which is a watery, kind of slippery fluid, and its primary function is to lubricate your joints. So if you look here, you can see that we have the ends of two bones right here. There's a thin layer of cartilage on the ends of the bones, but you can imagine that as these bones move against each other to create movement, you could have a lot of friction and wearing down of the cartilage and eventually the bone if it wasn't for the layer of synovial fluid that separates those bone ends. So these are very, very important structures to keeping us moving and to keeping our joints healthy. Membrane-like structures is the term that we use for membranes that don't structurally fit the description of the true membranes, like the serosal membrane and the synovial membrane. There are two main types of membrane-like structures. You have the mucous membranes, which are also called mucosae, and you have the cutaneous membrane, which is also called the skin. These membrane-like structures basically line all of your body passages as components of the walls of your hollow organs or the surface of the body. Basically parts of the body that have some exposure to the outside world. Your mucous membranes in particular are going to include membranes that line the respiratory passages, the mouth, the nasal cavity, the digestive tract, and the male and female reproductive and urinary tracts. The mucous membranes consist of a layer of epithelium supported by its basement membrane. Occasionally, this membrane also includes a bit of smooth muscle. A prominent feature of your mucous membranes are goblet cells, which you may recall are unicellular glands that secrete a watery but somewhat viscous fluid called mucus. Mucus is important because it can trap microorganisms before they reach deeper portions of the body. The mucous membranes also have some immune function, as there are specialized antibodies that are often on the surface of these tissues. Those antibodies bind microorganisms as they come into the body and prevent them from surviving and growing on our tissues. Our final membrane is the cutaneous membrane, and this refers to the skin, which is the largest organ of the body. The skin's most important function is that it serves as a barrier, separating the internal conditions of the body from the external environment of the body. And this is probably the most important protection that we have against infection. We'll talk more about the cutaneous membrane in the next chapter. For now, just keep in mind that this is a membrane-like structure. Its structure is not like a true membrane. The skin is a dry membrane, unlike the others that we've talked about, so it doesn't have like a liquidy layer on its surface. The skin is composed of an outer layer made up of several layers of keratinized squamous cells. This is a keratinized stratified squamous epithelium, and it's called the epidermis. Deep to the epidermis is a thick layer of connective tissue, and it has both loose as well as dense irregular connective tissue, and this area is called the dermis. The epidermis contains no blood supply, but the dermis is rich with blood vessels. So that's it. You're finally at the end of the histology chapter. For your exam, you should be able to explain the basic functions and characteristics of nervous and muscle tissue, mesenchyme, and membranes. Remember, nervous tissue, its primary function is to convey signals from one location in the body to another, and it does this via neurons. Neurons aren't the only cells in nervous tissue. You also have the glial cells, which are kind of like support cells. They help to maintain the health and integrity of the nervous tissue. Muscle tissue's primary function is to contract, and in contraction it moves body parts and substances throughout the body. Remember, there are 3 types of muscle tissue. You're responsible for identifying all of them. Mesenchyme was the embryonic tissue that gave rise to bone and muscle and your connective tissues. It looks like a field of star-shaped cells in a web of reticular fibrils. And then finally we talked about your membranes. In the lab, you should be able to identify any of the muscle tissues, the nervous tissue, and mesenchyme. So that's it. Yay! You made it! If you have any questions about this chapter or any of the others, remember, you can always send me an email, come to office hours, or send me a text. In our next video, we'll start the next chapter on the integumentary system. I'll see you there.